Marvel Snap's newest card, Lin Lie Iron Fist, is a very interesting card that actually has more angles than you might think. LL Cool F is a 2/2 on reveal that adds the Sword of Fushi to another location. The Sword of FU has an ongoing that gives LL Cool F 7 additional power if he is at the same location as the sword. So there's a basic move and copy synergy thing going on here that is largely something that lines up with how move decks have in the past functioned as Madam Web and Frigga style decks. And I saw as far as the move synergy, but I do think I missed out a little bit on some of the copy synergies, which are actually probably the more interesting part of the card. The move synergy is very straightforward, and we'll talk about that in the first deck we talk about, which is, of course, the Iris list. Now, as a side note, this is just what I think anyone would reasonably describe as a move mid-range. It's been like this for 6 months. I keep calling it the Iris list because that is the player who has been sort of the champion of this list, innovating and reworking it and incorporating new cards. Now, Iris is a great player, and this is a very difficult deck to pilot. My worry for this guy, LL Cool F, is that this is a card that I think is a little bit harder to play than people give it credit for, because at baseline, it's not really worth doing what it's doing, so you need to be doing something else, and also you need to be willing to understand the math of sacrificing board slots. I think one of the biggest differentiators between a good player and a bad player in Marvel Snap is understanding the value of board slots and what it means when you have used so many of them on X amount of power. Lin Lie is good enough to actually have a reasonable amount of payoff for being a 2 board slot card that you have to put a lot of effort into. You're not incredibly upset when you do something like Ghost Spider the Lin to the location that the sword spawned at. But, and I do think this is also pretty important, it's still using 3 slots in that case, making every method of moving that does not involve using 3 slots vastly preferable. And that is largely just Madam Web. And then the thing you run into with this is that, okay, I'm doing all of that. What turn am I doing it on? To me, it feels like the best turn with your good draws to be doing Lin and Madam Web is turn 4 a lot of the time, because there's just a lot of competition early. Your nut draw really wants to be Batroc, Sam, and Kraven, and so when do you actually get this guy on the board becomes a very real question. And when you're taking up that many slots on the board, does he start to conflict with your Batroc, Sam stuff? Is that a reasonable problem that you actually have to deal with? And the answer is largely yes, and it is not the greatest thing in the world. So he's not the optimal draw for this deck. He is a nice sort of backup stats guy that you can use to, say, have a draw of Lin and Madam Web to make it not nearly so anemic as it otherwise would be, but your good draws probably don't want to see too much of this guy. And that's a really interesting dynamic. He is at baseline just a reasonable enough card, but he's hard enough to make work that there are some downsides that come with him. Upside, of course, is that on the final turn of the game, pairing Lin with a Ghost Spider, assuming you're able to fill up a lane so you can guarantee where the spawn on the sword goes, is actually a really good thing to put alongside a Hydra Stomper. The downside is this deck is built to use the end game of Juggernaut Cosmo, so you don't actually often want to be doing your points package or whatever instead. I think that this is a really interesting card, but ultimately, I view it as extremely possible that in this deck specifically, he ends up superfluous to requirements. A lot of good players ended up in a pretty similar spot when it comes to move bounce. This list comes from Sizer. I've made one modification. Sizer is playing Grandmaster instead of Cloak. Grandmaster to optimize for extra Lin Lie. Of course, if you, for example, spawn the sword in the middle, you can then Grandmaster Lin to the middle. That's a very reasonable thing to do. It does actually move him around. I went for the other buyout of Cloak. I could be way off base here. It's possible Grandmaster is just a lot better, but I did feel like generally I would be more interested in a buyout for the entire deck rather than one that mostly just works with Lin. I could be underrating Grandmaster here, though. This is a pretty classic move bounce deck. What I find particularly interesting is the lack of Human Torch. That is not a guaranteed thing. I know Cougar was playing around in the same space and still had Human Torch in his list. I'm interested to see how this list develops because one of the cool things that Lin Lie gets to do is get Frigga, make a new sword, and then move them all to the location where you're getting a ton of power from your swords. That stuff is actually quite interesting. It's not the world's most incredible thing, but it is a really interesting dynamic where it's like, okay, I'm investing in this guy. He's doubling his own scaling. It's almost like a cheaper Daken a decent amount of the time. The ceiling is a lot lower, but it is a decent amount cheaper. And I do think that really does matter in terms of how often you can access this kind of stuff. Like, just baseline having Lin Lie and Frigga is like actually a really good use of Frigga, where normally this deck has to be forced to save Frigga for later once it's stacked something up. Just having a card where you're like, I am really happy. Like, this is like my V hand, right? I do this and I copy it with Frigga. That's my turn 2, turn 3. This deck hasn't really had access to something like that where Frigga is actually useful in that way before. And I'm kind of interested to see if that's a seriously meaningful upgrade. I'm not positive about what the end game here should look like. Like, there's some cool stuff going on, but it's entirely possible we just need to be back on Human Torch. It does seem a little ridiculous that we're not, but I buy the general concept of Lin being really good in a deck that wants to already play Frigga and some move cards. That seems extremely, like, legit to me. Taking this to the maximal logical conclusion, there is some really cool stuff you can do with Lin and the Ancient One. Lin is like Thor. His location, like, his text doesn't matter. The text on the sword does. So if you have a bunch of swords, they'll hit your Lins, right? Like, that will happen, right? If you get rid of Lin's text with the Ancient One and you give him a sword's text, the sword will still hit him. So what you can do is get Lin and the sword at the same location, put another card there, Ancient One, spell it, and you have 3 swords affecting the Lin. There's some stuff going on here that is actually like, oh, I didn't think that would work that way. There's also things like moonstoning the sword, of course. That's a very reasonable thing to do. The moonstone overlap also overlaps with Hydra Stomper, which means you have like Hydra Stomper Mystique and a moonstone. There's a lot more overlap between ongoing and move synergies than I would have expected. And honestly, I think this is a legitimately interesting cook from Honifer, taking the deck in a direction that I just didn't think would ever realistically be a thing. Of all the Lin Lie decks that I have on this entire video, this is the one that, to me, feels like the most impressive work to come up with. I think a lot of the other stuff, it's like, all right, you know, this makes sense. I didn't necessarily see all of it coming, but like, this is a bunch of interactions that I didn't think would like work in the way that they do, and in a space that has a shockingly larger amount of overlap than I would have expected. Being able to overlap Hydra Stomper with Moonstone and Mystique is actually just really good. Being able to Ancient One a Hydra Stomper is actually just really good. Like, there's a lot going on here that's like, oh wow, that's actually amazing when it works. And I think that kind of stuff is often left on the cutting room floor because it's not fully optimized, right? This is a deck that I honestly think has a lot of potential. I'm not saying you need to go out there and like go get all the cards for this deck or anything like that, but if you happen to have them, I think this is the kind of archetype that has room to grow. There's just a lot of strong stuff you can do in this list. Nobody really knows what you're doing. And so your power spikes are always incredibly surprising, and they are very legit. I also want to mention there was a player on ladder named Yacht Rock who was running a Frigga Bastion Lin Lie list, and I thought that was a very cool adaptation as well. I was unable to get in touch with this player in order to find their list and put it on here, but I just really wanted to highlight it because I think a lot of the goal of these videos is to tell you what the range on this card is. What are the things that you can do with this card? And I think a lot of what people are going to expect out of this card is, oh, you can put it in the Iris deck and maybe it makes it a bit worse and maybe it makes it a bit better. But what I've actually been the most impressed with this card with is the doubling and copying of it. Like, that's the thing where I look at it and I'm like, oh no, that's actually kind of sick. And so when I see the way this card has been accepted in the wider community, I do want to make sure and point out, like, there are people who are doing much cooler stuff with this card. I can't speak necessarily to the power level of that stuff other than to say that it feels kind of legit. Last up, perhaps the most boring and iffy of all of these lists, Cerebro 2. I don't like Cerebro 2. Now, to be clear, what you're doing with Lin Lie here is just putting him in your deck because he's Mr. Sinister across 2 locations. That is actually a card you want. You are happy to have this card in the deck. The problem is mostly Cerebro 2, where this is now a deck that has no meaningful location interaction. The problem with this deck is not, you know, Lin Lie. The problem with this deck is that Storm has 1 power now. And without Storm, this deck doesn't have either A, its best proactive game plan, or B, any way to get rid of locations that are bad that isn't a Nico Minoru. It's not a good spot to be in for a Cerebro deck. It loses out. What Cerebro 2 always had over Cerebro 3 was better force multipliers, and it still has those. It's got Mr. Sinister, it's got Brood, it's got now Lin Lie as a force multiplier to make sure you're getting as much out of your Cerebro buffs as possible. But it didn't have a meaningful way to protect Cerebro from interaction, at least not the way that Cerebro 3 did with Cosmo. Goose is fine, like it'll do it, but not well enough. And so a lot of what you do is use Storm as a pseudo protection. You would throw priority with a Storm on the board, and then what you would do is you would get your Cerebro in the Storm lane a decent amount of the time. Or you'd throw priority, and then you'd be losing the Storm lane, but you would use Cerebro to back buff the Storm lane. That was what allowed you to have, like, I'm winning the lane, but also I've correctly thrown priority here. Like, all of that stuff was good for you. In addition to providing location control, she was an integral part of your game plan. And I think that that is the biggest thing that I feel when I play this deck. It is just, I don't know if I can do this without Storm. I'm happy to try it, but long term, I would just rather play pretty much any other Cerebro deck. Like, when I look at a Cerebro deck that has no location control, I'm like, am I sure? The real question I'm asking myself is, am I sure C2 is better than C5? And that's just not a great question to ask yourself about a card that you really want to be excited about. So, how good is LL Cool F? Well, I think that if I had to guess, I would say that this card is probably making the Iris deck a little bit worse, but I am a little more optimistic on where he fits in terms of decks that multiply what he is. If I had to guess, he feels a little Daken-ish to me, where he's not really going to exist much outside of the context of that, like, Frigga, let's make this happen a bunch of times kind of thing. The payoff for this is the multiplication, which you get from either bouncing or copying him. That kind of stuff feels like a real space where this card is the only thing that's really interacting with it in that way. It's part of why I find the Honifer deck so impressive, because, like, I think that's just a really, really well put together version of a really, like, that is a synergy that nobody has ever played before, and I think he really got somewhere with it. It's really nice. And I think that this is a card that if I were to look to the future, I would imagine it being more in that space than in the sort of mid-rangey small ball, this guy's a 211 with my Ghost Spider kind of space. I can't say for sure, but I think the future for this card is potentially Frigga and other copiers related, rather than just being a 211. That would be my read on where he's at right now. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe if you made it this far in the video. I really hope you did. And of course, have a wonderful evening.